In this video, I'm going to try to explain to you how to read dynamic spectra. In particular, I'm going to use one of my favorite sources, G9.62 plus 0.2, to demonstrate some of the value that you can extract from dynamic spectra. Oh, hello. Just looking at a bit of data. This is pretty cool. Come and take a look at this. Dynamic spectra are made up of consecutive observations of individual spectra. Here I prefer having time on the x-axis and velocity on the y-axis. The contours give me the strengths of the maser features. Some people plot dynamic spectra the other way around, the time on the y-axis, so it looks like a waterfall going down the page. If we take a vertical cut, we get one of the spectra. And here's an example of one of the spectra. I used to stare at these things for hours. It used to drive me crazy. I call them squiggly lines. If you take a horizontal cut through this dynamic spectra, you get what most astronomers call a light curve or a time series. And here's an example of what Sharmila must have looked at, the brightest feature in G0962. The periodicity is obvious now, and it must have been amazing when Sharmila first saw this. Okay, I want to talk about an interesting source. Interesting to me, interesting to the world. And this source, 0962 plus 0.2, was first discovered in 1991 by Carl Menton. Carl called this source the mother of all methanol masers, a vague reference to the Second Iraq War, along with all of the other sources that he looked at. And it just changed things, because for us at Hartreo, it gave us a very interesting transition to study quickly, so we got after that. And then once you start getting past all the detections, you start doing things like polarization and monitoring studies. And we started monitoring several sources, including this one, okay? Including this one. And we found it to be variable, but that's about all we could say. We really didn't have the even spacing of the cadence. We didn't get the cadence right in the observing, because we were trying to fit it between VLBI programs and everything else running on the telescope. And so there was only one source I chose to monitor regularly, and we published those results in '96, whatever. But anyways, I left Hartreo, and a young graduate student joined Mike Gaylord, and he put her on to continuing the monitoring that Mike and I had started. And she actually made sure that she had several sources, and she made sure that there was even spacing between the observations, or as best they could, every 5 to 10 to 15 days. And anyways, long story cut short, this is the prototypical periodic methanol maser which Sharmila Goodhart discovered. And what a great discovery, really, what an excellent discovery. Well, anyways, years later, I returned to Hart in 2015. And I remember I talked to Sharmila a bunch of times, and it was just amazing, like how, you're doing stuff and it moves on, and they just find these amazing results, your data, and you're thinking, well, and I kept thinking to myself, why didn't I find it? And I'm not trying to be arrogant. I'm just saying, why didn't I find it? And the obvious answer was because of my cadence. Okay, I understand that, but I should have thought, I should have thought, because we did look for periodicity, and we just didn't see it. But I never thought to go back and look at my other sources that I was monitoring in that depth that I did with another source that I was doing at the time. Anyways, but I always thought about this source. I always wondered, and I was wondering if maybe in my old data and in the other stuff we could actually find this. So of course, I got all these kids. They come to me and say, look, we'd like to send you a student from some high school somewhere, and they shadow you, and you talk to them about astronomy and what they can do and how they can do it. So, and I enjoyed doing it, but I didn't like the fact that they would just sit looking over my shoulder while I'm working, sitting on a computer all day, staring at data, because it's just, it's disconcerting. It just is. I don't know about you, but the idea of someone looking at the back of my head, it's not attractive. Anyways, off topic. But one day I got this kid, Joel Paulson. He showed up, and I thought, okay, I'll tell you what. And what I started doing with these guys, Joel included, was I just put them to work. I just taught them how to process spectra coming from our trail. It's pretty simple business, you know, doing baseline fitting and Gaussian fitting and all those kinds of things. You just show them how to do it the first time or the first several times, and you gradually let them work on their own. And I had him for a few, I think he was there for a couple days. I can't remember how many days he was there. He'd come in, his mother would drop him off and everything else. Anyways, so Joel, I put him to work on 0962. I thought, you know, let's just take a look at this periodic maser. I hadn't looked at any of the data yet. So I thought, well, let's just look at the new data coming off the telescope, and I let him process it. And anyways, a day or so goes by, and I always tell the students, don't just process data continuously. Stop every so many hours and look at the results. Try to put them in some, you know, look at time series, look at the spectra, look at, you know, admire your work really, you know, and besides it kills the boredom, you know, because it builds up, you know, you're seeing something, you might be seeing something. Anyways, so he does this and he comes to me and says, Gordon, you know, I found one of the masers, one of the features is periodic. And I said, well, yeah, you know, they are periodic. But when I looked at Charmilla's paper, I found that the one that he had found had not been previously reported. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. A high school kid found a feature that's periodic in new data.
You can see Joel's new feature in the top of the graph marked by an arrow at 4.8 kilometers per second.
I thought, yeah, that's pretty good for a high school kid. Might even be publishable. And in fact, we did publish it later, but for a slightly different reason. But that was one of them. And so I thought, well, you know, I better take a bit more of a closer look at this data. And once you start thinking about that, you start realizing that, you know, how do you look at 500 or 600 spectra or 1,000? In this case, there's 1,000 spectra. And the easiest answer is dynamic spectra. So you start creating dynamic spectra of your large data sets, okay? And then you look at the dynamic spectra and you start seeing things. Because a dynamic spectra, it clearly shows the periodicity, as you can see in the data we have here.
So it's pretty obvious in this dynamic spectra that you can see the periodicity. Now, if you stare a little deeper, you start noticing that a number of the features in the bottom and in the top are actually moving away from each other. Red shifting and blue shifting. That's interesting.
And in that data also, you notice other things, like a velocity drift. So the feature that Joel found, the one at plus 4.9 kilometers per second, is not only periodic, it turned on after Charmilla started her monitoring program. It's periodic and it's velocity drift. And that was surprising. Because velocity drift can be caused by a lot of things, motion, etc., etc. But it could also be random. But it's still surprising that you saw velocity drift in something that's periodic. And anyways, so finally, you start realizing that in the dynamic spectra, there's a whole bunch of periodicity. Not just periodicity, there's a whole bunch of velocity drift. And we discovered that the masers that were more negative, so bluer, were getting bluer. And the features that were more positive, or red shifted, were getting redder. So they were drifting away from each other. Well, when you see stuff like that, there's no such thing as a coincidence. And not only that, we saw it in other transitions. So we looked at the 12.2, it had the same phenomena and features at roughly the same velocities. So these areas where the 6.7 and 12.2 were drifting at roughly the same rates for the same velocity features. And that's kind of cool. But it tells us there must be some sort of a common source of the drift. And we came up with two possibilities in the end. And the first was infalling gas. So as the gas is in a disk or something like this, it's falling on the surface of the star. So the masers themselves are drifting inwards. And that would cause the blue to get bluer and the red to get redder. Of course, they'd have to be on the opposite sides of what you're looking at along the line of sight. So the blue is in the back side coming towards you now, but it's coming through the disk, and the red's coming towards me, coming away from you. So that would explain that. And the opposite, if you want to see, that's how you do your Doppler shift. Anyways, you try to figure out how the Doppler shift would work in the source itself. And the second possibility, of course, which we couldn't discount, is the fact that if these things lay in some kind of a disk, and the disk is precessing, that may also cause this. So those two possibilities, there may be others. We looked at those two particular possibilities, and anyways, that was the story. So that was quite exciting. So this is an interesting source. So Carl Menton finds it. It's the brightest in the galaxy, and it's set off alarm bells all over the world. it turned us on to not only looking for more mazes, which we did, we also started monitoring. And then Sharmila found that it was periodic. And now Joel found new features that are periodic turning on. And more importantly, we discovered that it was velocity, its velocity was drifting, and in turn, so were so many of the other features, that there's some sort of common result causing this.
Okay, so now we've stripped out all the contours and are left with only the velocity as of some of the features. Now it's a lot easier to see the red shifted features getting redder and the blue shifted features in the bottom getting bluer. So now we start asking ourselves, is there some common cause? Is there some sort of background commonality? And we have two possible solutions. One is infall and the other is disk precession. Maybe there's something we miss. We'll keep looking.
This is a really interesting source. And all of that because we looked at the dynamic spectra. Because the dynamic spectra is rich. It has all this information in it. So you really want to teach yourself how to read dynamic spectra. It's better than simply looking at the spectra of the squiggly lines one at a time and say, oh, it looks like something's getting different here. You know, you can plot, you can superimpose them and all that. It looks terrible, especially with 1,000 lines. It's not going to look good. And likewise, you could do time series for channels, and of course, if there's a velocity drift, the drift will go out of that channel, and you'll think the source is dying, the feature is dying off. That's a no-no as well. So then you got to pep around with that. But once you've seen them in a dynamic spectra, you know to correct for that. So dynamic spectra is the way to go if you want to present 1,000+ spectra or 100+ spectra. Really, it's just so much better. Just learn to read it. Just take the time to look at it closely, and you'll find interesting things. And I'm willing to bet inside this source, we're going to find new and interesting phenomena still. There's still treasures in here that we haven't found yet. And I'm telling you, maybe it'll be 10 or 20 years, maybe it'll be years after I'm dead. But we continue to monitor. We will find more. We will find interesting. And you just keep looking.
Dynamic spectra is a great tool for presenting large volumes of spectra, in this case squiggly lines as I call them. You'll find all sorts of cool phenomena much easier, like periodicity or velocity drift, or maybe something else, flares, who knows?
What's in your data?